Thank you. I have one quick question. So we're looking at groups like 6th April or 25th January, but how do groups like the Ikhwan or the Noor Party use social media?
Ikhwan and what?
And the Noor Party, the Salafis.
Salafis. They do have very good skills in terms of internet mobilizing, and I remember very much that in early days they had actually an advantage on using it because they had networks, they had the time. So Muslim Brotherhood had been formed in Egypt for 7 decades. So whatever real-time physical connections they had, it was easy for them to transfer online. They've had the mosques, which is a social gathering place that every Friday they meet and then they can use online as a way to communicate between. So they had an early advantage by having those real-time and physical contacts and networks, and it was easier for them to transfer them to the real world. But by time, internet provides one of the key things, diversity. And that's something that they don't excel at. They are more into the religious kind of one-way interaction, one-way mobilizing, and that's not helpful online. People, if they are online, they have options. They can go, they can look for more information, they can communicate, respond, and choose to create their own way. And that's why, with time, they've lost that advantage online. And on that day, April 6, 2008, they actually didn't join protesters. And it was the first public, nationwide action that Muslim Brotherhood boycotted. And the result was huge. 30 to 40% of the people participated. It was the first sign that actually online, independent, secular or liberal, non-Islamist movement can shake things up. And it was clear a little bit later, 3 weeks later, they decided to join the online organizing movement on May 4th, 2008, which was Mubarak's birthday, calling for another nationwide strike, and it failed. So that was another sign that their force does not manifest well in the online world.
Any further questions?
I was just going to add. We did a story, if you Google MiddleEastVoices.com, about social media and the Brotherhood, I think. It's a very short story, but we, on occasion, will mention @Ikhwan and @Ikhwan Web. Ikhwan Web is the English version. Ikhwan Web always responds to us, and it's basically just to say, we're talking about Egyptian politics, this might be of interest to you. So they get it. I mean, I think I'm not so sure about the Noor Party, but I think, also keep in mind that Muslim Brotherhood is old school social media. They've been in mosques and they've been helping people in their communities for years, and when they get a message out, I mean, they also have real world networks to get out the vote or whatever they need to do in addition to social media. And so, social media tends to be used by people who skew younger or might be slightly more affluent, which isn't to say that people aren't going to use it. I think social media will have a huge role in political motivation from this point forward, but there's also other ways to communicate socially besides a phone or a PC.
You mentioned in your presentations, it seemed like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube were the main social media mechanisms that were used by the protesters to communicate, and also that the government seemed to be also figuring that out as well. I was wondering what new tools, social media tools, do you see these movements maybe adopting in the future to kind of counteract what the government may be learning about how they're using it right now?
I just have a brief comment, but I just think we have to think of the entire internet mobily. I think the main thing that'll change political awareness in the region is when you have a $25 Android phone at the corner shop. Once that happens, and also the data rate has to be affordable. But once they do what they did with dial-up internet and in some places DSL with mobile, everything changes. Because people can't, it's very hard in these countries to buy a $200 PC. But everybody's got a cell phone. We had some data and we looked across the region. In terms of cell phones, not smartphones, it's like 95%. It's people have more than that than cars and homes. They have cell phones. Once that becomes internet enabled and people are referring to that way, everything changes. And these people will be even more empowered, I think. But it's not so much the software to me as the hardware.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's why I use the word new media, not social media. And new media is basically social media and other media as well put together. And that's another power that, supersedes internet in itself. And to add to the point, we also mentioned crowdsourcing. And that's something that bridges the gap between cell phone and internet and makes it easier and shareable to use both. And crowdsourcing is a way to engage a huge number of population in real time. For example, the Shahidi mentioned, in the last election we've had around 100,000 followers, and we've had 2,700 reports documented by ordinary people sent through SMS, through email, and through phone calls. And with those came around 400 images and 200 videos of real-time events. And it was all put in one map of Egypt. So anyone at any point who wants to know election, what happened, they will see the map, they will click in, they will zoom in, they will find supporting materials in any form, short messages, email, video, and image, which brings everything together.
I have a question for the panelists. Looking over the horizon, although nowadays the horizon comes up very quickly. Do you foresee a time, and do you see a time where oppressive governments will have more success in shutting down or restricting social media, either through having the providers comply with local laws and lead to self-censorship, or more broadly, countries becoming virtual intranets where there cannot be access to Twitter or Facebook? And I think I've read that that's happening in Iran already. Of course, we know about China. I wonder if you see any sign of that in what you're watching.
Just going back to my earlier comment, yeah, they can do that. It's a real risk in Iran. They're thinking about having their own private internet, but they also do it at their own peril, I think, because the internet is designed to be free. I mean, there is definitely a risk, what Sherif was saying earlier, with individual companies changing their policies to comply with local laws. I think Twitter made an announcement recently on that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Twitter is going to censor. It simply means they're leaving a legal avenue open to comply when it makes sense. So I think, yes, depending on what companies do, it is a risk. But I think it's a bigger risk for the regimes because the internet is simply a way that everything will flow. Commerce, media, opinions, and if you lock yourself off, you're not part of the global community. And also, Facebook and Twitter are smarter than these regimes, really.
Well, I think authoritarian governments would do anything just to stay in power. So yeah, in Syria, till recently, till 10 months ago, Facebook was blocked. I mean, it was censored somehow. People were able, of course, to use it through proxy programs and stuff. So in my opinion, just like Davin mentions, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are much smarter than a dictatorial government to do such as that.
And I think that the main point here is by design. By design is internet as democratizing information and sharing the power among every single user. So that's why they can try, but they will be the underdog at all times. And the mere fact is information by definition is knowing. And I think those who want to share information will always have an advantage against those who want to suppress information.
What about coming at it from the opposite angle? I know recently there have been some stories out about private companies in Asia, North America, and Europe who are selling monitoring software to oppressive governments. They're not shutting down the internet, but they're attempting to know who the activists are by the software, which of course, you know, looking at it, it might be illegal software that's sold by American companies, but blah, blah, blah. It's out there.
I myself was a victim of that when was in last year, during this bad election that I talked about, the parliamentary election. There is a company, Gamma Group, in London that provided the software to the Egyptian government to be able to hack into Skype conversations, and they did not technically violate Egyptian law. Technically, they did not violate UK law, but of course, there were so many ways for them to be held accountable. And one of them is just the mere fact of pointing finger at them and saying, you are responsible for the life, the hurt that this will provide. And there is already people and Amnesty and other people that contacted me that wants to use that in a legal case to bring them accountable in the US by saying this is a direct, conspiring with oppressive government, and where they cannot simply deny they don't know why and how they are going to use this information as an oppressive group.
I think what happened online, what happens online, is a reflection of what's happening actually on the ground. The conflict that's occurring now between, let's say, Syria versus Iran, with Syria versus West, let's say. The sanctions that are being imposed by the US and West on the Syrian regime aren't actually effective as long as there is a country, there is a government such as Russia that is supplying. Russia is one of the main supplier of technology to the Syrian regime. So, as I said, what's happening on the ground, what's happening online is a reflection of a political conflict between two camps.
And I would also say that all you have to do is out that company. I mean, the thing about the internet, if it's a publicly traded company, say, hey, this company is selling to this government to suppress these people. That just needs to get around a few news cycles, and then that affects that company. Also, you're talking about one government contract. Well, one thing I think the Arab Spring has shown is most of these regimes were not that strong to begin with. They're rather fragile. Some may be more resilient than others, but if you're banking your business on selling to oppressive governments, at least in the Middle East, if they're falling, like 3 or 4 falling into a 12-month time span, maybe you need a different business model.
One more, and one more, and then we're gonna. Forgive me for being redundant if I am. I was out of the room for a few minutes, but I would agree with you that I think what happens on the ground is a reflection. I mean, what happens on the internet is a reflection of what's really happening on the ground. One of the main, I think, differences with what happened in Iran, for example, is there is popular support for the government in Iran by the people. And that's why the uprising, the Green Movement, really didn't take shape, because there really was not a huge support for that movement in Iran. The other question I wanted to mention to one of the panelists and this has nothing to do with the internet or social media, is you mentioned about out-of-country voting. As an Iraqi, I was very uncomfortable with voting for the Iraqi parliament while I lived outside the country for almost my whole life. What's your opinion about out-of-country voting? Do you really think it makes sense for exiles that have been living here very comfortably, you know, sipping their lattes and deciding to sort of elect the people that are there while they're sitting there in the struggle, understanding really the nuance and the whole sort of societal movements that are taking shape there that was completely out of the realm of the people that are living here? What's your opinion about out-of-country voting? I know that exiles love to be involved because they feel guilty, or for whatever reason they feel like, I've been out of the country, I need to have my say, I need to have my input there and feel good about it. But ethically it seems wrong. What do you think?
I don't have much to think, but to me, if you're a citizen or even a dual citizen, I think you have the right to vote.
Well, I was actually asking the Egyptians.
Oh, okay, then I'll shut up.
No, I'm sorry. Because I assume you're from...
I'm American.
You're American. Do you have a dual citizenship anywhere?
No.
Okay, well, let's ask the one
Sure.
you do. Thank you.
Well, it is the right of Egyptians anywhere to participate in their country's affair, and everyone have that obligation, not just because they have guilt or that they enjoy the lavish life that they have abroad, but I think they have a lot to offer to help their country, and they were forced out in a brain drain because of those who stayed in Egypt, sabotaged Egypt, oppressed Egypt, and now there's an opportunity for them to help their country get back on the right track. A lot of them have skills, knowledge, resources to offer. A lot of them have not forgotten about their countries. They're still connected and they're still contributing. I'll give you one example. In the case of Egypt, the second source of national income in Egypt is the contributions of Egyptians abroad. They provide around $12 billion of hard currency, yes, to the economy. And they've done that willingly because they know this is their country and they want to invest in it. And not just because they are feeling guilty, but they know this is their responsibility and this is still their country. In terms of Iran, I don't want to get into whether the Green Movement have a popular support or not. I'm not an Iranian, but I'm married to an Iranian.
So am I.
And her family has been part of the anti-Shah revolt, and I've suffered a lot and had to flee the country later on. And I look at Iran and I think this is not what I want to happen and want to see happening to Egypt 20 years later. I don't want this revolution to be stolen, the people who did it to be kicked out of the country, and the people to get back to their homes and be satisfied with whatever their government does. And that's why I think the Green Movement have had a lot of support, and there is real grievances that a lot of people share, but it's a matter of time before they can actually turn things around.
All right, thank you.
David, I will just add, for me as a Syrian, I need to wait until the regime is toppled, then I will be able to share my experience with you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Our next event, our next panel discussion is March 1st, 9 a.m. at SRI headquarters, 1100 Wilson Boulevard, 28th floor in Roslyn. And our next happy hour is March 13th at 6:30 at the Science Club on 1136 19th Street. Those are a lot of fun. I invite you all to come and participate. Let's have a big hand for our panelists.